understand climate change, its costs, and how to deal with it, let's apply some economic principles. Take a look at this chart from the Brookings Institute, which shows the cost of climate change by region as a percentage of 2012 country income. The chart aggregates climate change impacts from various areas, including agriculture, mortality, coastal damage, and labor supply risk. You can see that the greatest climate change costs range up to 27.9% of income. Why such high economic costs? First things first, you need to understand that climate change is a huge market failure. Nicholas Stern, renowned economist, said that climate change is a result of the greatest market failure the world has seen. But what is a market failure? A market failure is the economic situation defined by an inefficient distribution of goods and services in the free market. An inefficient distribution means that welfare is not maximized. We see market failures arise in two cases. The first case is when there are negative externalities present. This means that a cost is incurred by a third party in an economic transaction even though the third party had no control over the creation of that cost. Examples of negative externalities include air pollution, traffic congestion, and noise pollution. The second area where market failures arise is when there is a lack of well-defined property rights. When property rights of something are not well-defined, individuals often exploit the lack of private ownership and overuse the good, which is called a public good, or over-emit a harmful substance, which is called a public bad. An example of the overuse of a public good is overfishing in rivers, and an example of an overprovided public bad is the spread of an infectious disease. Given what we know about negative externalities, we can see that the cost of greenhouse gas emission, climate change, is often paid by a third party, the Earth and its inhabitants. And given what we know about property rights and public resources, we can see that greenhouse gases are an overprovided public bad, and clean air is an underprovided public good. So now we are facing rising costs of climate change, harm to public health, damage to agriculture, damage from extreme weather, and so much more, and those emitting the responsible greenhouse gases are largely failing to pay for these costs. In this chart published by the Brookings Institute, you can see a substantial increase in CO2 emissions if left unchecked, compared to curbed emissions in various climate protection agreements, namely the Paris Agreement. The globally agreed Paris Agreement aims to hold warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Climate Action Tracker, an independent scientific analysis that tracks government climate action and measures it against the Paris Agreement, predicts that temperatures will rise 4.5 degrees Celsius if countries do not act, 3.3 degrees if countries continue with their current policies, and 2.9 if countries follow what they have pledged. If greenhouse gas emissions are left unchecked, the Fourth National Climate Assessment predicts that the U.S. economy will shrink by as much as 10% by the end of the century. So then, economically speaking, how do we fix this? Economics teaches us that government intervention is required to reach the socially optimal outcome when a market failure is present. The socially optimal or efficient outcome occurs when the benefit to society of producing one more unit of greenhouse gas, the marginal social benefit, is equal to the cost to society of producing one more unit, the marginal social cost. At this point, the price is equal to the marginal cost. It is only when we reach the optimal or efficient outcome that welfare will be maximized. This will happen only with government intervention. Among economists, there is overwhelming support for government intervention to correct this market failure. The expert consensus on the economics of climate change reports that 77% of economic experts support unilateral emissions reduction commitments by the United States, regardless of the actions taken by other nations. Now, the question that remains is simply, what policy is to be implemented? Climate change policy that will be effective in correcting this market failure must balance the cost of action and the economic damages from inaction. Let's look at some potential policy solutions. Market-based instruments are recognized for their potential to reduce emissions by also allowing for flexibility and ingenuity in the private sector. They include financial incentives, such as subsidies that reward polluters for reducing emissions, emissions taxes, like a tax on carbon emissions, and a cap-and-trade system, where permits equal to an allowed level of emissions are distributed to each party, and parties can trade permits based on the price of permits and their desired level of emissions. There are also some noteworthy command and control regulating instruments, such as technology and performance standards and product bans, but market-based instruments have proven to be the most cost-effective. Policies such as these already exist in modest capacity, but many more will need to be implemented to reach a socially optimal solution for climate change.